history of avant-garde artistic practices has long been centered around major Western cities such as Berlin and Paris. So the established narrative positioned these metropolises as the main or the central sites of radical innovation, reducing the rest of Europe, as we already heard in the keynote, especially East Central Europe, to mere imitators or kind of latecomers. Of course, the one exception is the Eastern, so Russian, Ukrainian, Georgian avant-garde, so the place of the October Revolution. This marginalization is rooted in a persistent perception of cultural lag or this backwardness. So, for example, I remember in high school how we learned about Slovenian poet, avant-garde poet Srečko Kosovel, often presented as our local equivalent to European trends. So finally, at least in literature, we were supposedly in step with the core of European artistic movements. Yet the emphasis was always on how we were catching up. And such narrative, of course, perpetuates the notion that avant-garde in our region was derivative or secondary. But what this canonization also actually tells us is that the conventional canon portrays avant-garde as a linear phenomena, a cultural activity that needs to produce enough art objects or enough followers that would endure the test of time. And also that avant-garde is primarily driven by culturally equals economically dominant regions and usually also male artists. A big step forward in recognizing women as active participants in the Yugoslav avant-garde Yugoslav avant-garde and Yugoslav avant-garde, so historical Yugoslav avant-garde is my research focus, is a publication of the correspondence between Anuška Kon-Micic and Ljubomir Micic. This was published, this book was, so the correspondence between the partners was published in 2021. This correspondence happened in the time when Ljubomir was in exile in Paris and Anuška in Belgrade. I think I hear myself. Should I? And this book basically reveals the active role the active role in production in Zenitist movement by Anuška. So her financial support, authorship, also editorial work in the Zenitist movement. And previously it was thought that her work was limited to translation and secretary tasks within Zenitism. Another key contribution for this topic in Yugoslav historical avant-garde is Žarka Svirčev's monograph Avantgardijski ogledi o srpskoj i ženskoj avantgardnoj književnosti. So the translation would be Avant-Garde Women, Essays on Serbian Women's Avant-Garde Literature. This was published in 2018. Through her research on avant-garde periodicals, Žarka Svirčev showed that women artists and editors were a fundamental part of the Yugoslav and broader South Slavic avant-garde. Deeper research and recognition are still needed for the work of many avant-garde artists, such as, for example, in Slovenia, Teja Rotar-Černigoj, and her contribution to Slovenian and August Černigoj's constructivism and the Trieste constructivist group. I think it is a telling fact that out of the 10 works by Slovenian constructivists in the collection of Ljubomir Micic, and this collection is in the National Museum in Belgrade, 2 are collages by Teja Černigoj and 2 by Edvard Pančić. Furthermore, in a letter, Ferdo Delak writes to Ljubomir Micic in Paris, mentioning that in addition to August Černigoj woodcuts, Marinetti's clichés, and works by Chargo, he also can send Teja Černigoj's article. So what we consider as a traditional canon has marginalized some diverse and transformative contributions from the so-called peripheries, gender peripheries and spatial peripheries, resulting in a double or even multiple marginalization of women avant-garde artists in the space of East Central Europe. And even though there are many new books being published, East Central Europe is still underrepresented. It is notable that when studies attempt to reconstruct this marginal or minor avant-garde, they often begin by emphasizing its supposed elusiveness. And this acts almost as an excuse, or at least discouragement, for further research. Titles such as, and you'll recognize some of them, Impossible Histories, or reference to this kind of flashes of avant-garde in Yugoslavia or South Slavic avant-garde, suggest that on the contrary, European avant-garde movements were linear, continuous, or progressive in time when situated in the West. In response to this fragmentation, my research engages a lot with archives to reconstruct a narrative, or better, a chronotope of the Yugoslav avant-garde. And this work is included in my already mentioned book, Yugoslav Avant-Garde and Metropolitan Dadas. Torej, in Slovenian it will be, here's the cover, jugoslovanskega avantgarda and metropolitanska dada. This is a book very much about the topic of hierarchies. So in the first part of introduction, I address the center-periphery dynamic, decentralization and pluralization of art and literary history, while in the second part of this kind of longer introduction, I focus on the contemporary relevance of avant-garde studies and avant-garde artistic strategies, particularly concerning the urgency of environmentalism and European eco-critical theory, which is essentially also multilingual and intercultural. The rest of the chapters represent an attempt to reconstruct a Yugoslav avant-garde network, focusing on Dada examples, but not just looking for traces of Yugoslav Dada movement, but also for Dada techniques and Dada tactics in other Yugoslav avant-garde movements. The first and final chapters of the book trace the trajectory of Yugoslav Dadaism to places, concepts, artists, periodicals, also samizdat publications, as well as correspondences, which allow us to reconstruct this chronotope that I mentioned of Yugoslav Dadaism. In relation to other European avant-garde hubs, these chapters outline the Yugoslav transversal of the artistic avant-garde. So for example, I include in book places, of course, Zagreb and Belgrade in the beginning, also the regions of Slavonia, so Osijek and Vinkovci, Vojvodina, Novi Sad and Subotica, and later in the book I also focus on Ljubljana and the Goriška region, as well as the Friuli, Venezia, Giulia region, so Gorizia and Trieste. And the book kind of emphasizes their connections and mobility across various European locations, so also kind of connections to other avant-garde places, movements in Prague, in Brno, Budapest, Berlin, Paris, Vienna, and of course Russia or the Soviet Union. My focus is shifted to the processes of power that shape these historical and contemporary narratives, and to the marginalized and minor identities. So I'm kind of interested in all the expressions that kind of show any kind of also justice agendas and world-building characters or world-building qualities that is very much present in avant-garde. So what Alexander Flacker would call optimal projections, so ability to enact different futures. So my argument is that some of the most innovative international artistic practices and cooperations emerged precisely in these historically overlooked regions, particularly in this region of former Yugoslavia that includes borderlands with Italy and Hungary. In the Balkans, there were no art markets and no fully industrialized cities at the time. Thus, this rejects the notion that radical practices are necessarily tied to metropolitan centers and emerge from technological and economic progress or access linked to specific economic or technical activities. These historically neglected and peripheral regions of Eastern and Central Europe are where the true radicalism of avant-garde practices emerges. In the upcoming slides, I will mention important books and references that kind of are used as basics to kind of make my contribution in the field of the avant-garde studies. So several recent studies have corrected the established view that Dada belongs to Western European cultural centers and have reinforced the significance of Eastern and Central European Dadaist movements. So Yuri Lotman argued that the periphery plays a crucial role in the development of art and culture because it represents a space of dynamics, tension, and conflict with the normative ideology or aesthetics of the center. So he basically demonstrates that peripheral genres in art are more revolutionary than those at the cultural centers. So this non-linearity, non-hierarchy, randomness are of exceptional importance for the avant-garde and its practices. With sudden emergence of new nodes and the dissolution of existing trajectories as defining characteristics of its network or its rhizomatic functioning. Thus, instead of viewing the avant-garde in terms of center and periphery, it is more productive to conceptualize it as an intermediary space, so a place of constant exchange or as a boundary, as characterized by Lotman, this kind of borderland space that he evolved in this book, in his book Znotraj, so Inside the Thinking Worlds would be the English title, Vnutr misлящих миров in Russian. So the borderland space is the place where the intrusion of foreign worldviews happens. This approach is also supported by this latest study on Dadaism, Cannibalizing the Canon, which sought to capture the complexity and plurality of Dadaist phenomena beyond the conventional concepts of avant-garde movement or avant-garde manifesto, as these concepts hinder the theoretization and visibility of some lesser known and poorly documented phenomena, as well as non-programmatic, short-lived and hybrid expressions. So in this theoretical framework, Dada is no longer understood merely as an organized artistic movement. After all, Dadaism was never a unified Dadaist aesthetic, but rather as a series of practices or Dada tactics, as they name it in the book. So this allows us to study all avant-garde expressions on the same level. So from a formal performative practice and lifestyle strategies to magazines and other outcomes of artistic work. Also, consequently, the understanding of this kind of influencing of one movement or one component to another is also kind of altered. Instead of this static influencing, which limits both the nature and outcome of this process, we can speak of macro or micro transfer. And this leads to hybridization and methods of continuation through selection and manipulation. So depending, and I take this theory of transfer from Tomasz Glantz, from his article or chapter that is also written on the slide, not here, so here, yes. Yeah. So depending on the specificities of the environment in which the transfer occurs, it operates partially through permeability and partially through resistance. Instead of a mere continuation of a component in its original form, a subversion of the entity being transferred often occurs. So what this means for Eastern and Central Europe Dadaism, and what in this book Cannibalizing the Canon they observed, instead of passively adopting certain components in East and Central Europe, the active transfer is understood as a form of cannibalization, signifying the critical and creative appropriation of Western artistic models. So this means, and what we can observe, as that Dadaism in East Central Europe holds a particular critical and social connotation. And for Dada, this is not so usual, right? Because of its playfulness, meaningless, and so on. Often it is in the East or East Central Europe, Dadaism is also often connected to constructivism that is based, as we know, on the idea of social revolution through art. Just allow me a second. I think this is a very inspiring also quote. I'm sorry because it is written in, it's translated actually from the Malte Hagener's chapter from English to Slovenian, but still I just wanted to keep it on the slide because it kind of really clearly, visually tries to convey this idea of a network and its connection to avant-garde. So we need to rethink the avant-garde as a pluralistic and network phenomena that transcends geographical boundaries. The whole central point of the avant-garde was their international cooperation, so going beyond the borders of one's national country, or providing a space, a physical platform for hosting foreign artists, also migrants, or migrants established it, like think about Cabaret Voltaire, and so on. Or a platform, if we think about the magazines, the small magazines, little magazines, it also can be considered as a platform for circulation of international works that was usually realized by these magazines or edited volumes. These magazines are as traveling exhibitions. They had the agenda to influence, to connect people around same aesthetics and ethics, and also internationalize those ethics and aesthetics. So having this network imagery, when we think about avant-garde artistic practices, I would like now to mention, and this is kind of the part that is also kind of, I think, the most important part now of this contribution. I would like to present some concepts and theories, but also trends in humanities that support this rhizomatic perspective on avant-garde. So what kind of was needed so we can now have these books on, or so I can work in this field of study of avant-garde, trying to decentralize it, trying to find new ways to create this kind of network understanding, or kind of, also I think what is important is that this kind of network and pluralization of avant-garde also gives us the possibility to pluralize our understanding of modernism and modernity, and I think also that is important. So I would like to start from the global art history, the so-called global turn, which emerged at the turn of the millennium. This has revived interest in the concept of world literature and world art history, exploring art and literature from a cross-border and global perspective in a time marked by migrations, digital media, and economic globalization. This orientation has in recent years expanded and deepened the geographical methodological scope of these fields, and this is reflected in research focused on non-European cultures also. Also on the study of economic and cultural power centers and the relationships between center and periphery, as well as in the consideration of different regions, interconnectedness, asymmetry in addressing non-Western works. Also mobility, circulation of works, their internationality, also nationality, have also become essential aspects. The global aspect and transcultural complexity of literary and art systems can be understood through the concept of worlding, which is also again a new kind of better concept than globalization. In Slovenian literary theory and history was introduced as svetovljenje by Marko Juvan, but originally was theorized by Heidegger as das Welten, in being and time. Of course, I would now re-mention, as it was also in the keynote, the concept of horizontal art history. It's very central for avant-garde history. It advocates for a more inclusive, non-hierarchical view that treats all avant-garde phenomena as interconnected nodes rather than a hierarchy of influences radiating from Western centers. Based on the evident exclusion of Eastern and Central European art and other marginalized parts of Europe, Piotrowski discusses the dominant vertical art history, a term he uses to describe the hierarchical approach of modernist geography and art history. And of course, as many also artists, he touches this concept of orientalization of the cultures of the other, as described by Edward Said, which I think is also very important to mention. Critical geography would be next to quickly mention, while Piotrowski critically examines and deconstructs the concept of universal European avant-garde art and his art history through the inclusion of approaches such as also critical geography and geohistory. A similar critical reflection is also happened in literary history by Franco Moretti, David Darmoš, Pasquale Casanova. All these books kind of show different kind of approaches to challenge the monolithic understanding of the world literature canon, demonstrating that this constantly evolving, heterogeneous entity manifested in various contexts and forms, which often exclude certain regions and certain works. The topographical or spatial turn is crucial. It takes into account the specific cultural and political history of the place where the artwork originated. Such an approach reveals work from geographical, cultural, and linguistic peripheries, but also simultaneously it critically analyzes this Eurocentric theoretical model or models that have shaped the discourse on the avant-garde since its formation in the early 20s. Mentioning also, of course, the Latour's actor network theory, or in French, it's réseau, so it's kind of both. It's not just a network, but it's also the activity of networking. This kind of allows us to think three-dimensionally, to kind of think about the network as something that is constantly evolving. It's a structure that's basically in flux. And it combines connections not only between, but also alongside focal points, as well as loose ends at the periphery. This is a fluid, a non-hierarchical structure that persists as long as the flow of interactions between diverse entities remains active. And this network kind of concept was explored by Hubert van der Berg on the example of avant-garde. Last thing I would like to mention is the digital humanities. It's a kind of new paradigm challenging the old approach to canon research. While Marinetti proposes, as we know, the formalist category of distant reading instead of critical reading and deconstruction of individual texts, this method allows us to analyze large units of the system, forming the new models and patterns. In avant-garde studies, this was applied by Beatrice Joyaux-Prunel, and I will just show a couple of, this is Maja Stankovic, but also uses the same kind of visualization. It's basically around the platform Zenit magazine, in her book Umrežena slika, but this is research by, you can see it, Beatrice Joyaux-Prunel. She applies this type of distant analysis to the case of avant-garde magazines, and she uses social network analysis and digital visualization to create a cartography of periodicals in Europe during the 20s. And what she kind of shows that this was not Paris in the center, as we might think, but that peripheries were more active. Which I think it's a brilliant kind of research. It's quantitative and something that can also be very inspiring when we think about if our region was important when it comes to these radical avant-garde artistic expressions. So you can see the Central Europe, it's there, the biggest kind of, so this approach represents a genuinely new way of viewing the field, moving beyond traditional analysis of specific stylistic or aesthetic categories. The author, and this is another of her network analysis images in the paper, there is the source. The author demonstrates that the reality of the avant-garde was much more polycentric, and that the peripheries were far more interconnected, productive, dynamic than the centers, especially in terms of the publishing and dissemination of avant-garde magazines. Also here you can see Zenith, they are quite large in the visualization. So canonical hierarchies and monocentrism, which the historical art canon has long strived for, reveals an incomplete narrative supported by a centralized idea of international geopolitics in art. Just to conclude, the consequence of such a perspective will not only be a more comprehensive map of the avant-garde, but it will also shift attention to practices of exchange, practices of production, transformation, instead of merely studying the successful results of material traces of art. Relying on material outcomes has been one of, I think, the limitations of art history, which has traditionally operated within components such as artist, nation, school, movement, overlooking precisely the significance of this kind of transformative process of the avant-garde. Thank you.